is actually chosen from this set, well, that directly contradicts y is preferred to z, right? Now suppose that z is chosen from this set. Well, if z is chosen from this set, then it needs to be chosen from this set because x is chosen from this set over y, and there has to be at least something chosen from this set. And so that would, again, be a contradiction. So by the weak axiom of revealed preference, we always get a violation of y being preferred to z. Sorry, we have z being preferred to x. Okay. So a utility function can be viewed, one way to view a utility function, though I don't think the right way to view a utility function, but one way to view a utility function is simply being a representation of this preference relation. That is, all it says is that, well, what exactly does it say? How can we view it as a representation? Jin, Zong? God, nobody's here. Jin, Zong is not here? Okay. So how do you, what is the utility representation of a preference? Everyone's got to know this.
I is referred to y, u is great.
Exactly. So it's defined by saying that u of x is strictly greater than u of y if x is greater than y, and this is obviously only defined up to positive monotone transformations in this case. And for some purposes this is sufficient, but it obviously makes it impossible to do any interpersonal comparisons of utility because the units are completely arbitrary, right? So there's just no way to compare across people, and it's therefore very unsatisfying from a normative perspective. I also, more importantly, want to argue that this minimalist notion of rationality is just unpersuasive, and in fact, it doesn't really have any content at all. So I want to try to persuade you of that. So let's consider the classic paradigmatic example of violation of rationality, the one that if anything is irrational, you would say that this is irrational. So I just want to take the most extreme case so that no one thinks I'm setting up the strong one. So Kahneman and Tversky's most famous experiment. So in setup 1, you have to choose between letting 200 people die for certain or letting 600 people die with 1/3 probability and nobody dying with 2/3 probability, right? So almost everyone in this case chooses option 2 because they want at least some chance of nobody dying, right? Okay. Setup number 2 is that 600 people will die if you do nothing, and now you have two choices. You can either save 400 people for sure, or you can save 600 people with 2/3 probability and no one with 1/3 probability. In this case, almost everyone chooses the first option because they're risk averse, right? They want to make sure that they save 400 people. Okay, so it's pretty obvious on reflection that these are describe exactly the same situation, right? That in this case, relative to the true status quo, 200 people die. In this case, you have the same problem. Anyways, you can just link them up with one another, right? This is the classic Kahneman for. Yeah.
Isn't there a third choice? And I mean, it looks like there's a third choice in the second setup, which is if you don't do anything.
What do you mean?
Well, it says like 600 people will die if nothing is done, but there's nothing in the first one that says like what happens if nothing is done.
Well, I mean. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. I mean, the third choice is irrelevant. So I mean, it doesn't really matter. But so a lot of the standard Kahneman and Tversky argument is that these things are equivalent. People make opposite choices, ergo people are irrational, right? But is it that obvious that these things are exactly the same? So in fact, a lot of philosophers have argued that the framing is ethically significant, and that these two things are not exactly the same, and that it's perfectly rational to have a preference of one over the other, and then reverse your preference. Because it's true in some consequentialist sense these are the same, I guess, depending on what one views as the consequences. But from a just absolutely literal interpretation that we can only care about the internal consistency of decisions, You could say, well, one is this consequence after having heard the problem framed this way, one is this consequence after having heard the problem framed that way, and the other one is this consequence after having heard the problem framed the other way, and this consequence. And so then there's no necessary link between the two things because the full description of the outcomes is different between the two things. So some people would say, well, who's to say that this isn't relevant to the person making the decision? If it's relevant to them, then they're acting in a perfectly rational way. Right? Yeah?
And actually, if we think people make inconsistent choices because they're just not smart enough to realize that these are actually the same choices, that would also be not violating rationality, right?
Yeah, I mean, if they didn't realize that they were the same.
You just can't. Yeah, you're not smart enough, and still you might.
But let's forget about that. Though I think that's an important issue. But let's forget about that for the moment. Even it's not obvious that, I mean, I would strongly believe, and I would strongly argue that these things are the same. But certainly that is an assumption that's external to the idea of internal consistency. That is, there's nothing inconsistent with saying, I am completely internally consistent, but I view these two things as not being the same. Right? In other words, the identification of these things as the same as one another is something beyond the notion of internal consistency of choice. And yet, if we start going down that road, we start saying that, oh, we can call things that seem exactly the same different for different people. Literally, rationality loses all its content. So anytime you try to say people respond to incentives or something like that, I can always find a way of saying, well, actually, that wasn't what their incentive was. There was this other factor that was relevant as well. So, in other words, we literally never, in economics, never, and literally never in any type of reasoning, rely solely on things about internal consistency. We are always imposing value judgments. So the standard argument that you hear all the time that economists don't make any value judgments, we just take people's preferences as given and just say that they're internally consistent, that is always hogwash. There's literally, that you're never doing that. You're always saying that this is or is not relevant, plus this person's choices are consistent. Yeah?
Isn't this indication problem doesn't arise from the standard, like for example when we see bundles, we say apples. Well,
yeah.
Apples today aren't the same as apples tomorrow, and some people are really weird, and then an apple like wearing a jacket is different than an apple not wearing a jacket. Or whatever, like, you can always like...
What I would, yeah. So I would say this shows up in literally every economic context. And in every economic context that I know of where rationality is ever applied, it's more compelling than it is in this example to say that things are relevantly different. But I think this is actually the most extreme reductive case where it should be the most compelling. And in every other application, the way in which rationality is applied is less compelling. And I'll give some examples on the next. Yeah.
On this setup, I still feel like there's just problems right now that are framed differently, but if this was a real world, I feel like the top one makes the first choice sound like it's an inaction, like if you do nothing, people die, and the other one sounds like if you do nothing, you save them.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure that, like, while if you frame it differently, but if it's real world event, like, you have to actively choose to take a risk on people's lives or actively save some people's lives, there's a very good chance that I would much rather not have to live with the guilt in my community of knowing I risk everybody's life and loss.
Well, of course, and that's, I mean, the point is, so that's exactly the argument that moral philosophers make about why these things are relevantly different from one another. So the point is, but you could literally give me, I mean, if we want, we can go back and forth, but I promise you, you give me any example that you think is clearly irrational, and we can make up another story under which it's not irrational. So literally, you cannot do anything based simply on the consistency of choice. So some methodological takeaways from this are, first of all, that rationality is not really an assumption about behavior. It's a language for talking about behavior. That is, and that's true of like basically all scientific theories. So if you think about like Newtonian physics means nothing until you state what are the set of things that exist, what are the set of all forces that are operating in a given situation. Universal gravitation makes no predictions unless you know exactly what the set of bodies are, and you can only bring in dark matter and everything changes. So it's just not an assumption that implies particular predictions. It is a way of interpreting or a way of talking about the phenomena that we observe. And the same thing's true for evolution. You know, we can interpret things as adapting to their environment, and that may be more or less useful, but it's not falsifiable in any way. You can't test evolution per se. So what matters is much less, testing the theory, but rather how fruitfully can we use it. The question is never, is this rational or irrational behavior, but is there a plausible and useful way to analyze this in terms of rationality. And almost all useful and plausible ways of interpreting behavior in terms of rationality require incredibly strong restrictions on how people behave. So, for example, one of the most powerful assumptions is that people have quasi-linear utility. This is going to show up all throughout the course. But we know that we can relax that in a whole bunch of different ways. And the truth is, it's just not very useful to say that's a restrictive thing, that's not implied by rationality. The truth is, it's only really useful if you can propose an alternative hypothesis of how people behave that will allow you to do something. Because literally just saying, well, all we can impose is rationality, by definition, says zero, as I just pointed out. It literally says nothing. This assumption is only powerful because it does more than internal consistency of choice. At a normative level, what this means is that whenever we criticize each other's thinking or arguments and claim that they're inconsistent, we're never literally just saying that they're inconsistent unless it's a purely mathematical thing. But if it has anything to do with the real world, we're never just saying that it's internally consistent. We're always drawing on something about what we think is or is not a relevant distinction between situations. So, for example, I think that one of the most compelling examples of applying internal consistency to say that a policy view is stupid is that the Republican Party seems to believe that if a check sent to someone that says Department of Human Services, that's bad. But a check sent to someone, the exact same person, in the exact same circumstance, that says Department of Internal Revenue is good, because the latter one is a tax break, and the former one is is some sort of a welfare payment, right? But these things are exactly the same. Well, the Republicans say, well, no. If it went through the government, somehow it's become tainted, and maybe that is relevant. I don't think it's relevant. You guys probably don't think it's relevant. But it relies on more than just saying that what they're saying is inconsistent with one another, right? So that doesn't mean that internal consistency is not a useful way to think about things. Because one useful way to make an argument against someone is to say, I don't think that's a relevant distinction that you're drawing. But it's completely ludicrous, in my view, to think that the only way we're ever allowed to communicate with one another, or to say that someone else is saying something wrong, or to say a certain behavior is silly, is to say that they're treating as relevant distinction something that's not a relevant distinction. There's lots of other things that we can say that are at least as compelling as saying that something is not a relevant distinction. And so I want to try to go through some examples beyond things that can be phrased in those ways that are at least as compelling criteria for saying someone's kind of crazy or saying something silly. John Humphreys, what do you think might be some examples of criteria beyond internal consistency that you might not want to have a conversation with someone if they weren't willing to subscribe to that?
Well, so you have stronger types of consistency across lines, across time.
Yeah, sure. That's a good one. We'll get to that. So I'll go through some. So one is just that they have some plausible preferences. So, lots of things in our life tell us that certain preferences are implausible, others are plausible. For example, I'm sure that in your common everyday use of the term rationality, you would think that someone who has